Genesis chapter number 13, and we'll start at verse number 10. And here we see that Abram and Lot, who Abram would eventually become Abraham, but at this time, he is still named Abram. And he and Lot, which is his nephew, are living in the same place, but they found that their livestock has started to fight, right? You ever had a time like you got a little bit crowded, like you love your family, but your kids, they started to fight, or your cousin's kids, like everybody starts to kind of get, they were a little bit too much in a close proximity. And so they decide that they need to spread out. And Abram tells Lot, he says, listen, you can go wherever you want to go. I give you first pick, first choice of where you want to be. And so Lot takes that to heart. He actually does it. And it says, starting at verse number 10, Genesis 13, Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan. Lot's like, listen, you said I could have whatever I want. So I'm going to take the whole plain. Give me the whole thing, the whole plain of the lot of Jordan. It says, and he set out towards the east, and the two men parted company, and Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain, and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are to the north and the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. Now, have you ever made a decision that did not turn out the way that you thought it would based on how it originally looked? Anybody, like, you ever had a time like you thought it would turn out one way because when you looked, it looked a certain way, but then once things actually took place, when things actually happened, it was completely different than how you thought that it would be? Lot made a decision here based on how it looked. He looked out and he saw the whole plain of the Jordan, and it looked good. It was well watered. It was beautiful. It was preferred. It was amazing. It was the best option in Lot's mind for what he could see. But it turned out that it was not what he thought it would be. And the land that he chose that was so beautiful and so amazing and seemed like the obvious choice was later destroyed. This land that he chose that he was so excited about was later destroyed. And it was taken out. And I feel like that can sometimes happen in our lives, right? Like, we make a decision, we choose something based on how it looks, because it looks the best, right? We like shiny things. We like the things that everybody else would say was amazing. We like the things that everybody else would say, oh, that's what I would want. We make decisions and we see things that look good, and then we make the decision that we're going to pursue those things, only to later find out that those things either were destroyed or they lead us to some kind of destruction or some kind of breakdown in our lives. But in the moment, it looked so good. Anybody ever had a relationship that looked so good? A job opportunity that looked so good? It's like somebody came and told you they're going to pay you $150 to just sit in a cubicle. You'd be like, yes, sign me up. But you don't know all the inner workings. There's things in our lives that on the surface, it looks so good, but God says that's not really what you need in your life. So Lot made a decision based on how it looked, and then eventually things fell apart. And when this happens in our lives, what is our first instinct? To blame God. Our first instinct is to blame God. Sometimes we may just feel like we're being punished. Right? Like, God, I know this was a good thing and I messed it up and I'm sorry, but now I'm being punished. When the reality is, we chose to settle. So this morning, I want to talk to you on this subject. It seems right. It seems right. Let's pray together. God, I thank you for today. Thank you for every person that's here today. I thank you for every person that's joining with us online. Lord, I pray that you would help us to have ears to hear from you today. Help us to have eyes to see from you today. Lord, nobody to see and hear from me. May we see and hear from you. Lord, I pray that you would speak to our hearts. Help us to be open and receptive and to apply it. And I thank you for it in Jesus' name. And everybody said, Amen. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened to you in your life, but you ever had a time where you saw something in pictures that looked good, but once you actually got there, it wasn't? Right? Anybody who's doing online dating, right? Like it looked good, okay? Or you like ordered something, door dashed it, right? And it looked good in the pictures, and then it showed up and it's, looks terrible, and it looks great in the picture, then you actually get it, and it's not what you thought. It's not what you signed up for. And this is why I generally will not go on vacation somewhere that I have not been before or that has not been told that I should go, right? If it's been recommended by somebody I know and somebody I trust, I will go. But otherwise, I don't like to go places just willy-vanilly, right? Oh, let me just look at the pictures. Because photographers are skilled, right? Photographers got some skill, and they know the angles to take. They know the lighting. They got Photoshop. They got the filters, right? Some of y'all, you post every picture you post on social media, you put hashtag no filter. It's like, please stop. Like, we know, okay? We know, right? You're lying, and we know. It's okay. We all do it. But we have filters. I remember back in like 2020, 2021, people in droves were buying houses here in Atlanta sight unseen from other states just based on the pictures and trusting their agent. And it's like, this is very risky because real estate photographers are skilled. You ever gone to look at a house that you saw online and you thought it was huge inside? It's because the wide angle lens, but you walk in and it's like a closet, okay? So they're skilled. And so it's what I'm trying to say is just because something looks good in a picture doesn't mean that it is, right? And if we're not careful, then we may end up in a situation where we have completely invested ourselves into something only to be disappointed. And this is something that I learned the hard way. Back about 7 years ago, I was in charge of planning mine and my wife Nicole's 1-year wedding anniversary. Okay, and I was trying to figure out where are we gonna go? What are we gonna do? And so I talked to our friends, Johnny and Natalie Burkhalter, and they said, listen, there is this place. You gotta go to Hatteras, North Carolina. Anybody ever heard of Hatteras, North Carolina? Okay, the underwhelming majority in here, like 3 people, right? I had never heard of Hatteras, North Carolina. It's the Outer Banks, right, of North Carolina. It's on this Outer Banks island in North Carolina. And they're like, it's so beautiful, it's amazing. Well, they had never stayed in like a hotel or something there. They had stayed in a house because they were just there for some ministry stuff. So I'm like, okay, cool, that's where we're gonna go. They said it's the most beautiful place, it's relaxing, it's amazing. 10 hours away, okay? I don't do long distance driving, but I'm like, hey, it's our 1-year anniversary. We're gonna do this thing. So I get on Google, I'm looking, and the first place I find is just beautiful, right? It has beautiful rooms, it has beautiful beach, which is important because Nicole loves a good beach walk. It had beautiful pool, like it was amazing. And so I called them and I booked it. And the time came for us to go, so we get in the car and we drive 10 hours. And I was so proud of myself because I'm like, I've stepped outside of my comfort zone, right? I'm a big believer. I preach on this. Get outside of your comfort zone. I'm proud of myself. I got outside of my comfort zone. I did something. We're going somewhere that I've never been before, that nobody's ever stayed at this specific place before, and I was excited. It is the last time I will ever do it because we drive for 10 hours, we show up, and finally the GPS says you have reached your destination. And I'm like, okay, something's wrong with the GPS. Because when I look to my left where it wants me to turn left, it's like this little gravel driveway. Okay, this is before Airbnb was cool. And so I see this little gravel driveway, and Nicole, who is, just like the most positive person you will meet, right? Like just so positive, always. Like it could be the worst day ever, she's gonna be positive. She said, is this it? I'm like, oh, Lord, you're gonna have to step in here. Because I look and it's like this little gravel driveway and then a house. right? That's it. I'm like, online, there were like 12 rooms to choose from. This house does not have 12 rooms, but then I look further back and this guy has built these 2 buildings that have the rooms. And so Nicole, because she's positive, she's like, I'm sure it's amazing inside. I'm like, Lord, if it's not, make it so, right? Like, let's do something. Let's do a suddenly in our lives. So we get inside, and the guy who owns the house, he's talking to us, and he's going to show us around. And the first thing he says is, this place has survived many different hurricanes. And I'm thinking, we can tell. You know, like, we're walking around. He's like, many hurricanes. So then he takes us to show us the pool. And it is like, basically, it's a hot tub, okay? It's not this big pool. It's like a oversized hot tub. And he said, but unfortunately, it's out of commission right now, so the pool's not working. And so I said, okay. I said, that's cool. I said, now, question, is this the same pool that was on the website? And he said, no, that one was taken out by a hurricane about 10 years ago. Years, okay? Like, okay, cool. So then he said, and there's the ocean. And I look, I'm like, okay, cool. It's got water. It's got the ocean. The problem is to get to the ocean, it's just like this marsh, right? Like the tall grass, like the Everglades, think that way. That you got to, like, that's the only way to get to the ocean. So Nicole speaks up and she says, where's the beach? And he says, oh, the beach is about 2 to 3 miles. If you just get in the car and drive about 2 to 3 miles down the road, you'll get to the beach. And I said, the beach that was in the pictures online? He's like, yes. These jokers drove 2 to 3 miles down the road, took a picture of a beach, and then put it on their website. It was awful. But because we were young, dumb, and in love, right, we made the most of it, and we made it just like this amazing, fun experience that we were able to have. It was a great time and amazing. But it was not thanks to anything that was in the pictures. And I chose the place based on what I saw in the pictures. But when I got there, what was in the pictures and what I was expecting was not there. They got us to buy into this thing based on the pictures of something that was not even there. And this is exactly what the enemy likes to do into our lives. He likes to feed us these fake photos, these fake pictures to get us to buy into some things. And when we get there, it's not even there and we've been bamboozled. Because he will use things that look good on the surface, but once you actually arrive, you realize things are not what they seemed. It is so easy to become enamored with what I like to call staged pictures. And that's the first thing I want you to write down is staged pictures. It says in verse number 10, Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan from Zoar towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Lot looked around and everything was good. Everything was beautiful. It was well watered. It was lush. It was perfect. It's exactly where you want to bring your livestock. It was amazing. Everything looked good, but everything wasn't good. And if you are making the decision, like maybe the land looks good, but if you chose to inhabit the land just because it looked good instead of following God's leading, guess what? You're gonna settle. Yeah. If you follow the leading, if you feel like, hey, listen, there's a relationship that looks good on the surface, but if the only reason you're engaging in that relationship is because of how it looks and not because you are following God's leading, you will settle. If you have an opportunity in your life that looks good, but you feel like I've got to give into this thing because of the way it looks and you're not following God's leading, guess what? You're going to settle. And I get it, I know it, because some of us were like, listen, I've been waiting for so long. Some of us, we've been waiting so long for the opportunity. We've been waiting so long for the relationship. And this is the best thing we can see. Some of us, we're coming into 2023 and we're like, after all that I've been through in 2022, after all that I've been through in 2021, this is just the best opportunity that I can see. And we're engaging in those things without ever saying, God, is this what you have for me? And when we do that, we settle. Just because you can see something does not mean that's what God wants you to partake in. Just because you can see the opportunity does not mean it's the opportunity God has for you. Just because you can see the relationship does not mean it's the relationship that God has for you. We have to make up our mind. I'm not going to just go after it just because I can see it, just because it looks good, but I'm going to wait and see what God has for me. Many of us are settling for less instead of waiting for God to do more. We're settling for less instead of waiting for God's best. We're settling for what looks good in the moment. And the reason that many of us settle is why? Because we are tired of waiting. Tired of waiting. And I believe that's many of us here today. Like, we're here, we're online, and we've been waiting for God to do what he said he would do. We've been waiting for God to show up in a way that only he can show up. And we haven't seen it yet. Anybody who would be honest and say, like, there's some things I've been waiting to see God do and it has not happened yet. I've been hoping that God would do it and it has not happened yet. I've been wanting to see him show up and it has not happened yet. And many of us, we're settling because we're tired of waiting. And we're like, if you just knew how long I've been waiting, if you knew how hard it was to wait for God to do what God said he was going to do. I get it, but hear me on this. The pain of waiting is far less than the pain of settling. The pain of having to wait for what God's going to do is far less than the pain of settling in a place that you think is best. Whatever it is in your life, it is worth waiting for God to show up. It is worth it. It's worth the sleepless nights. It is worth the pain. It is worth the frustration where you're at. It is worth the back and forth, but you got to make up your mind. I'm not going to stop believing. I'm not going to stop trusting. I'm not going to stop pursuing what God has because God's best is on the way. God's best is on the way. But if you settle where you are at, if you settle for what looks good, if you settle for what feels good, if you settle for what makes you feel good in the moment, then you miss what God has for you. And one of my greatest concerns for us as followers of Jesus is that we are lowering our level of expectation to the place where we are instead of raising it to the place that God is taking us. It's 2023, right? And some of us in January 2023, we're at a place that we're believing for a great year. And the reason we're believing for a great year is because the things we are now believing for are so easily attainable. Because we have lowered the expectation. In 2020, we were disappointed. In 2021, we were disappointed. In 2022, we were disappointed. And in 2023, we're like, I'm tired of waiting, so let me just lower my expectation down to a more manageable place. Let me lower it down to a place that I think God can actually do it, because I don't believe God can do it anymore. It's not something we would verbally say, but it's something that our actions have said. Because we've lowered our expectation down to the level of what we think can happen instead of raising it to the level of where God said he was taking us. So for instance, maybe in your marriage, you've been 10 years and you haven't gone a day without an argument. So it's like, God, if you could just give us one good day. If you could just give us one day in our marriage where everything is smooth, instead of believing that God can completely restore your marriage. Some of us, maybe like you've been without a job for a couple months, and it's like, God, if you could just give me a job. I don't care what it is, anything, and whatever, like just do something. Instead of believing that God can bring a job into your life that is greater than where you were before. Some of us, we're at this place where we're like, because you battled depression for so long, you're like, God, if you could just give me one reason to smile. Just one reason, like just one smile. Like I just want to have one reason to be happy. Instead of believing that God can restore and give you happiness, unconditional joy that cannot be taken away. Many of us have settled in our lives in some areas, and we've lowered our expectation down to the place that we believe God can do it instead of raising it to the thing that God said he was going to do. And we have settled for less than God's best. And the reality is, the hard truth is, as long as you can live with settling for less than God's best, you will. Like as long as you are okay, just scraping by, just barely holding on to hope, like hope is just barely, as long as you're okay with just settling for less than God's best, that's exactly where you're going to be. That's exactly where you're going to stay. And I believe God came today to tell somebody that you need to get back to a place where you raise your expectation again. Where you raise your level of expectation again. Where you say, I'm going to hope bigger. I'm going to dream bigger. I'm going to believe bigger. I'm going to trust God bigger. I'm going to know that God is going to do something. Tell somebody it's time to expect again. It's time to expect again. If you're watching online, type in the chat. It's time to expect again. Many of us, we used to expect, and I don't know what happened. A lot of things have happened. Life is hard. I get it. It's difficult. And I would never stand up here and pretend to know everything that everybody else has gone through. But what I do know is God is just as real and available today as he was in 2010. I know he's just as real and available today as he was in 2009. And I know that God is able to show up and do what he said he would do. There is nothing that has happened in your life or in the world that has broken God's promise. Nothing in your life has broken God's promise. God will keep his word today the same way that he always has. But if we make the decision to settle, see, this is why the enemy does this. This is why he brings us things that we think we need to go after, things that seem right, things that seem good, because he knows he cannot stop what God is going to do. But if he can convince you to settle, then you can stop it yourself. And Lot looked at this land and he was led by how it looked, by how it seemed. It says in verse 11, so Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. And the two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain near Sodom. Abram ended up where God wanted him to be. He ended up in Canaan where God wanted him. Lot never even consulted God. Do you see this? I mean, it says Lot chose for himself. The next thing I want you to write down is don't sell out to bad advice. Don't sell out to bad advice. They both sold out 100% to something. Lot sold out to himself and to his own advice, where Abram sold out to what God had said. And a lot of us, we've gotten to a place where we're no longer sold out to what God has said because it took too long and it seemed too impossible and it seems like there's something better and it seems like there's a greater opportunity. And God is saying, I don't want you to sell out to your own advice. I don't want you to sell out to your family's advice. I don't want you to sell out to your friend's advice. I want you to sell out to my advice. What did I say? What have I promised? Where am I leading you? What have I said is going to happen in your life? And this statement, y'all, this statement is the one that God would not let me get away from this week. And I believe it's one of the biggest statements in this text today that I want us to see. The thing I believe God wants us to know is that we have to be careful that we don't sell out to who we want to be at the expense of who God made us to be. That we don't sell out to who God called us to be at the expense of what we want to be or the expense of where we want to be. Lot had free choice. He could have chosen anything. He could have picked anywhere. He was given the option to choose wherever and whatever he wanted in that moment. And he didn't even take time to pray about it. He didn't even take time to ask God. One of the reasons we have 14 days of prayer and fasting to start the year is not just to be a fad, not just to go with what everybody else is doing, churches all over. It's to get us reset and refocused on the power of prayer and of sacrificing our desires. Because a lot of us have gotten to a place where we make a decision before we ever consult God. We choose something before we have ever even asked God, what do you have in my life for me to do here? Lot never even asked God, never even prayed, never even sought him out. It says that he chose for himself. He sold out to what looked good in the moment. He sold out to what looked the best in the moment. And many of us, we are selling out. And that's good. Like, it's good. Whatever you're going to do with all your heart. But we are selling out, and we are trying, and we are striving, and we are pushing, and we are doing all these things, and nothing is turning out the way that we thought it would. Nothing is going the way that we wanted it to. Nothing is going the way that we prepared for it to go. Nothing is going how we expected for it to go. And we're frustrated and we're blaming God, but it's not God's fault. It's that we settled for something that looked good over something that God said was good. It's that we settled for something that we could see instead of waiting for what God said. And we are so occupied with the wrong thing that we can't even see the right thing. We're so occupied and distracted with the appearance of it instead of the substance of it. Lot chose for himself, but Abram, it says, he consulted God. He said, God, where is it that I'm going to go? Where is it that you have for me? And God led him to Canaan. And in verse 15, it says, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. This is amazing. There's beautiful land right there. And Lot takes the obvious choice. But just because it's obvious does not mean that it is best. Just because it's obvious doesn't mean it's where God's leading you. Lot saw what was obvious, and it seemed so good and so obvious that he never consulted God. If there is something in your life that you think is so good that you don't need God's help, you need to turn and go the opposite direction. Lot saw this land. He's like, I don't need to ask God. I don't need to pray about it. It is too good. It's so good. Abram, on the other hand, is like, hey, God, I need your help. I need your direction. Abram's like, listen, I've made some mistakes in my life. I've made some wrong decisions. See, we think that when we make wrong choices, that's always a bad thing. It's a good thing if you'll learn from it. Abram's like, I've made some decisions before on my own, and I don't want to do that again. So God, what do you have for me? And God said, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. And the last thing I want you to write down or type in the chat, if you're taking notes, is that there's a proper time. Proper time. God said, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. He said that to Abram. He did not say that to Lot. Do you realize that? Like, he's talking to Abram here. He's not talking to Lot. This was not a group statement. This is for Abram here. And he says, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. To Abram, not to Lot. Why? Because Lot settled and Abram didn't. And many of us are not seeing what God said, not because he did not say it, but because we've settled. Many of us are not seeing what God said, not because he did not promise it, but because we settled for something that looked good in the moment. And we've settled in a place that we were just supposed to pass through. We've settled in an environment that we were never supposed to stop at, that we were supposed to just see as a moment in time. And we've settled there, and we're now unable to see the greater thing that God has for us. But real quick, I know it's 11:10, I gotta get you out of here. But real quick, I'm gonna get you to your naps. I'm gonna get you to watching the Dolphins pull the upset over the Bills. I'm gonna get you to all these things. I'm gonna get you out to this. But real quick, can I point one more thing out? Real quick, promise. Nobody said yes, so I'm just gonna do it anyways. I take that as permission, cool? So in preparing this week, my struggle it wasn't with Lot, right? Like, Lot is obvious. Lot settled for the land without consulting God, and then he ended up in a mess, right? That part's there. My struggle was, God, how do I encourage those who have not settled but are still not seeing it? Because some of us, we're here today and we're like, hey, I'm Lot, right? Like, some of us inside, we know, like, yeah, I've settled. I've settled in this relationship that I'm in. I've settled in this opportunity. I've settled in this ministry. I've settled in this job. I've settled in this business. I've settled in this career direction. I've settled in this thing. Some of us, we know, like, hey, we're playing a little bit of Lot here. We've settled, and now we can turn it around. And we can draw close back to God, and we can say, God, what do you have for me? We know we've settled. But some of us, we've been waiting for years. Years. Like, we have not settled. We've watched as everybody else has stepped into what God had for them, and we've waited for years. Some of us maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years. Some of us maybe longer than I've been alive, which is 33 years. Still. Somebody before service was talking about 2024, and I was like, you will hold your tongue. We are in 2023, and I'm at the age where every year matters and every year counts, okay? But some of us, we've been waiting for so long, and we have not seen what God said. And I kind of think maybe the reason Lot settled is because he didn't want to have to wait. He looked and he saw land that was ready to go. He looked and he saw land that was ripe. It was well watered. It was perfect. I don't have to wait for a thing to be able to make this work. So it's like, God, what about the people that have not settled but haven't seen it? Because Abram did not settle, and he saw the land right away. God said, no, he didn't. And I was like, yes, he did. God was like, no, he didn't. I know that y'all are more spiritual than me, right? So like you always just, whatever, it's just like you don't even struggle with things. Like you don't even go back and forth. Sometimes you're just like, oh yeah, exactly, without understanding. But for me, God's like, hey, I made Dustin in such a way that he's got to kind of give me a little pushback, and then I'm going to push back, and then I'm going to show him why he's wrong, right? So I'm like, no, he didn't. He didn't see it right away. Or he saw it right away, and God said, no, he didn't. And then God took me back to verse number 15. And it says, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. All the land that you see, I will give. Now, if you will give something, what does that mean? You have not given it yet. If you will give somebody something, it means that you have not given it yet, which means Abram had not yet received the land that God said he was going to give to him and the offspring. Abram did not settle, but he did not receive what God said immediately. He didn't receive it. Now, he and his offspring would receive it, but it didn't happen immediately. And then God took me to Galatians 6:9, which says, let us not grow weary in doing good. Why? For at the proper time, you will reap a harvest if we do not give up. At the proper time. And I'm talking to somebody this morning who came in and you've been feeling like giving up. You've been feeling like quitting. You've been feeling like stopping. You've been feeling like settling. But I believe God wants you to know your proper time is still on the way. It's still on the way. Your best days are not behind you. Your best days are still ahead of you. Your future is bright. The promise is near. But you cannot settle where you are at. It may seem right. It may look right. It may even feel right. Your own parents, grandparents, aunt, uncle might have told you that it is right. They might have said it, but don't settle. Do not settle for who you want to be at the expense of who God called you to be. Do not settle for the place where you want to be, for the place that God is calling you to go. There is a proper time that God will show up and do what only he can do in a way that only he can do it. But we have to make up our minds. Listen, I'm not settling. That thing seems right. On paper, everything is right. But I'm making up my mind. I can't settle for that because it's not what God said. I know that this relationship seems right. But God, is this where I'm supposed to be? No? Okay, well, let me just leave. It looks right. He makes 6 figures a year, got a house, and a job. I could be a stay-at-home mom. It seems right. God, is it right? Just because something looks good doesn't mean it's God ordained. And in 2023, I believe we need to reset our focus back on what looks right and turn it back to what God said was right. Turn it from what feels right, what society would tell us is right, what we want to be right, and say, God, what do you say? Because that's the place that I want to be.